All right, here we are. Welcome back to Bookwave. We're looking at Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life today, An Antidote to Chaos. Going to be checking out the first two rules. How did you guys like the first chunk of this book, guys?
I really enjoyed it. It's my second time through, and the first time I read it, I wasn't really acquainted with Jordan Peterson. My stepfather had gotten the book and recommended it to me, and had a hard time getting through it. But a couple years fast forward, I've watched a lot of his videos and his speeches and his lectures, and listened to Akira The Don's 12 Rules for Life soundtrack, which is just fantastic. And so I'm going into it with a bit more insight and really enjoying his writing style. I'm surprised. I didn't recall just how much metaphor in relation to the Bible he used, which isn't surprising, but still caught me off guard. But an all-around good time. What do you think, Pat?
Yeah, my thoughts exactly. I don't know if you wanted to start talking about the overture or the first rule. What do you want to start with?
Well, I have one line in the overture that I picked out that kind of ties in with what you were talking about, Will, with the whole religious thing. He's talking about his first book, and he says, I proposed in Maps of Meaning that the great myths and religious stories of the past, particularly those derived from earlier oral tradition, were moral in their intent rather than descriptive. Thus, they did not concern themselves with what the world has, as a scientist might have it, but with how a human being should act. I suggested that our ancestors portrayed the world as a stage, a drama, instead of a place of objects. I described how I had to come to believe that the constituent elements of the world as a drama were order and chaos, and not material things. So that's a good little way to set the stage for the rest of the book here.
It's kind of like the opening to a movie, then.
It's interesting. It makes me remember the documentary on Joseph Campbell shot at the Skywalker Ranch, talking about his Hero with a Thousand Faces and things like that. And I remember a quote that I'm not going to quote directly, but he says, like, the Bible was great prose. These were really good metaphors and stories on how to live a life that is likened to that of heaven, that God is a concept, that the greater good and your greater capacity for self-awareness and consciousness and existence is rooted in the internal, not so much the external realities, but that heaven or hell is something you make for yourself. And I see a lot of that in Jordan Peterson's writing.
Yeah, I was a big fan of Joseph Campbell before I ever heard of Jordan Peterson. So, like, I had all that idea in my head, but I noticed there was a big difference between the way Joseph Campbell answers the question, do you believe in God, and the way Jordan Peterson answers it. Because you ask Joseph Campbell, he just says, no, I don't believe in a personal God. But, the Bible's a great book. It's perfect. And you talk to Jordan Peterson, and he says he acts as if God exists.
And I also think that is what's missing in today's society. It seems like people who misinterpret this kind of message are the same people who bash religion entirely as this Bible-beating religion where, the old school cultural religious types who say, if you don't believe in God, you're going to hell, you should repent for your sins, and blah, 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 blah. But the way Jordan Peterson rephrased this in the overture, as well as bringing up the yin-yang symbol and the Taoists, gives more of a updated spiritual message and not some kind of overly religious type of information. He wants to look at it. He looks at it in a different lens. And the way that Joseph Campbell brought up the Bible as this great book of prose, instead of looking at it or treating life as if God exists, kind of like the way that an old school culture tribe would, you have to look at it in the lens of a modern trope and take out different pieces that are fit for you and are positive and practical in real life.
So I had just finished an introduction to Jung's psychology, and this ties into what you're saying, Pat, and I'm going to come back around to Jordan Peterson, but Jung grew up around his father, who was, I believe, a pastor and was doing funeral services all the time. 8 of his uncles were clergymen, and he talks about how those that follow Christianity are trying to repress the bad, and they do a very poor job of trying to be nothing but good and not accepting their shadow, and that the repression of that badness, the ignorance of it, leads to some serious issues. And the way it ties into what Jordan Peterson has to say, because I remember watching that video about how much it would take to really be able to say you believe in God, that there are very few people on this planet who deserve to say they believe in God, because when you look at their actions, it does not reflect a belief in God, and that it takes so much to live up to that potential, that it is a real responsibility to be honest and open and in your greatest version of yourself, to be deserving of that statement that I believe in God, because words are a dime a dozen and actions obviously always speak louder. And when you can't reflect your belief in every instance of your life, you really don't deserve to say that, because obviously we're always failing and growing and overcoming obstacles. But when we don't truly look at ourselves and take sober stock of the pitiful wrecks we are, it's half-assed, it's ignorant to say we believe in God if we're not doing our best to become and to grow and to act as if. And I think that's really interesting when you look at it in that light, that there's so many people out there that are Sunday Christians, right? They go to their mass, they donate to the communion or whatever it is. I really am not religious. I don't know the terminology. They give money to the church. They eat their wafer, they drink their wine, they go home and they continue with their vices and act as though they're these virtuous saints that really fall so short from the mark. And it's upsetting. If more people could truly reflect a belief in God in their everyday life, perhaps Christianity would have a better perception globally.
Or better yet, in addition, if treating life as if God exists doesn't work, you can treat life as if you're caring for somebody else, someone who is very important to you, whether it be a relative or a romantic partner or a best friend
Or a
pet for that matter, which is something we can get into in Rule 2. And I would also like to add, with the idea of finding a meaningful purpose, I recently been following what's going on in China and the Hong Kong protests and what the current Generation Z crowd is thinking about. And according to some sources, Generation Z is mostly apolitical. They don't care about it. They don't want to get involved in what's going on in, universities, and they don't want to get involved in conflict with far left types and far right types. They just want to be themselves and live an average life. But the problem can occur if they don't have anything purposeful. And when there's no purpose, that ultimately leads to nihilism and meaningless action. And living as if there is a higher being, or living as if you are more important now, is a step up. It's a head start.
It reminds me of some of the things Simon Sinek says about these bigger corporations and why Apple is so successful, and the whole concept of starting with why and really getting to know your why. Because if you don't have that core value, that central purpose that you start from, you have no base, no foundation. If you build your house on sand, when the waters rise, your foundation falls out from underneath you. And a lot of people get so tied up with the what, and then they try to figure out the how. And I think that's very backwards. And that's where Simon Sinek comes in, with the start with why, and then how, and then you'll get to your what. And I think that's really important for a lot of people to let that sink in, you know. And like we've talked about it before, if you don't study politics, if you don't know the ins and outs of all of the different types of schools of thought, you can act out a political value or ideal that you don't agree with, but not even know that that's what you're slipping into. We talked about that a lot in Atlas Shrugged, that it's really important. You know, the life unobserved is not worth living.
And through the elevation and development of the individual, and through the willingness to bear the burden of being, will allow you to stand up heroically and take on any challenge that you face.
Yeah, and it's like, I've been watching a lot of the videos and commentary on both sides of it about these child advocates and protesters and social justice warriors that are very strong about their opinions of things. There's things they know they value, but the issue comes when you don't have experience to understand the impact of the real world, that it's hard to make a good choice when you don't know the ins and outs of all the other choices. If you don't know that the dragon's inside you, how can you be the knight in shining armor?
Yeah.
Or just being able to control it like a pet.
Exactly. So let me ask you guys, let's hone in on that first rule, stand up straight with your shoulders back. What was your biggest takeaway from that chapter?
The biggest takeaway is, for me at least, if you are hunched over all the time and your default setting is always quote unquote average, and you're not gaining any joy outside, not only will you get further in life, but you're also going to die young. And it made me think very carefully about the essence of how serotonin works, and being able to show how flexible you can be physically, using the examples of the lobster. I think it was a 350 million year long example.
Yeah.
And the lobster has been around since dinosaurs, and they still exist. The longest, well, from what I know, is the longest forms of existence. And so we all look at different people as being, the strong types. We can take the gym builder, for example, as this big muscular guy or gal who wakes up every morning very early than most people do to just work out. And some people might look at that and say, okay, sure, he works out every day, he gets sore, and he sweats a lot. What's the point of that? Just to, build stronger muscles, to, just stand tall, possibly beat some people up. But the important thing is the reason why gym builders go to the gym and work out constantly for an hour, 2 hours, sometimes longer than that, is to train them mentally to take on different challenges that they will face during the day, no matter what it is. And so the idea of growing muscles and developing amino acids in your system and being able to make a full recovery easily and effortlessly will allow them to stand up for themselves, whatever conflict arises. Same thing with other people in life, like like business individuals, people who work in business or marketing. I work at a marketing organization, and I'm usually one of the few people who wake up early just to go there. Not because, it's an hour away from where I live, but because I'm going to be bombarded with lots of emails, lots of invoice statements, lots of ideas from the marketing team. And I have to be able to figure out, along with the marketing team, as well as the accounting team, okay, how is this going to work out? What's the agenda for the day? There's going to be many people who are going to contact us wondering, okay, are the checks going to be cut today? When do we expect a check? How are we doing with EB5 and all that stuff? And so being able to stand up straight with your shoulders back allows you to be prepared for whatever challenge you might face, and being able to walk out of that challenge unscathed and confident.
Absolutely. One thing I do want to add before we get Scott's takeaway is there was a book that was published. I'm not going to cite it because I don't remember it, but the takeaway I had was that 90% of the Fortune 500 CEOs were surveyed, and their workday started 3 hours before they had to get to their business, because they know that when you wake up early and you give yourself time to meditate, exercise, eat a proper breakfast, and prepare yourself before you get to work, instead of what I see happening a lot is people sleeping in, hitting the snooze button, rolling out of bed, throwing on their pants, grabbing a coffee at Timmy's and running into work. And then they're spending the first 3 hours of their shift just trying to wake up. And by the time they get to lunch, they're almost in a place where they can really start to kick ass. And the day's halfway over and they're already thinking about going home. But the most successful people know it takes a while to get yourself into that right mindset. And mindset is so important. And if you neglect that aspect of yourself and you don't give yourself that time, that self-care in the morning, you're going to be missing out on so much of your potential. And it's devastating. And that's why it is so important to stand up straight with your shoulders back, to take care of yourself properly, to give yourself that attention.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's really hard not to fall into the mindset of, oh, my day starts at 4 o'clock when I get off work, because for the rest of the day I'm just, working.
Yeah, like that's a third of your life. Like how you do anything is how you do everything. And if you're not showing up to your job ready to kick ass, even if you hate your job, you have to ask, what's the secondary gain? If I work for 40 hours a week, I'm able to do X, Y, and Z, and I really like X, Y, and Z. So I'm going to value that job and I'm going to give it my best so that I can get my best out of it when I'm in the other 2/3 of my life. Because the fact of the matter is 1/3's at work, 1/3's in bed, and you've only got 8 hours left, and there's 2 hours or more eating and prepping food and cleaning, maybe another hour and a half of travel. So you've got this sweet spot of 4 hours. And if you're in this shuffling around mindset where you're looking down, you're hunched over and you're giving up on yourself, and then you're ruminating for those 3 hours and you're on Instagram and Netflix and Facebook, it's toxic.
It also will affect the lives around you, other people around you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you want to be the person that brings the mood up or the person that is bringing the mood down?
Yeah, and it's easy to rationalize to yourself, like, I don't want to give the best of myself to this company that treats me like garbage. But at the same time, the other half of that is you're also just portraying the worst part of yourself during 8 hours of the day. And what does that say about you?
And what does your brain think about that? What calculations are you constantly making about yourself at a subconscious level
it's almost like you're teaching yourself to be resentful towards the world. It's a trap that a lot of people are falling into.
And also you are putting risk on the table along with everyone else and the job that you work at.
Absolutely. How many workplace injuries could be avoided if people woke up, meditated, and ate a proper breakfast?
Yeah.
Got enough sleep.
Yeah. What's your takeaway, Scott, from the first rule?
I really liked what he had to say about just the infinite feedback loops. About how, like, when the Lobsters were defeated and then they just put themselves in their own place, and then it just keeps cycling over and over again, how they just keep feeling worse and worse about themselves until they get to win a fight, and how they like grow a different brain once they lose a fight, and how just getting
Yeah,
put in their place can really change the overall chemistry of your brain.
absolutely. Let's take a quick break here for a little bit of a mid-roll.
And welcome back.
So, discussing that first rule, I want to share my takeaway, obviously. One of the big things that is on my mind and has been for a couple of years since I got my hypnosis training is the concept that Pat brought up. People say there's type A's and type B's, right? The people that can get up in the morning and go for a jog at 5 a.m. And there's tons of people that like to categorize and label themselves as type Bs. Like, oh, I'm just not that type of person. I can't get up in the morning. I can't do that because that's just not my personality type. And I reject that principle. I don't think it's easy to get up in the morning. I don't think many things worth doing are easy, but I certainly believe that with the right conditioning, you can achieve anything that any other human achieved to a certain degree and to a very large extent. And so my biggest takeaway, and something that I'm doing my best to absorb into my life, is the aspect that Jordan talks about with a lot of his clients. Is, look, you need to go to sleep at the same time as everyone else. You need to get up at the same time every day. You need to eat breakfast. And if you can't do that consistently, of course you're going to have anxiety. Of course you're going to have depression. Obviously you're going to have a hard time because right away your brain is saying, oh, I'm different than the rest of the world. I just can't function the same. I can't go to bed on time. I can't get up on time. I can't feed myself properly. I must be weak and inferior. And the minute that starts to happen, and it's happening 100% of the time, you get put down a rung on that ladder of where your brain feels you are, and your serotonin receptors don't give out as much serotonin as someone who's doing their best to get up and stand up and stretch their body and live their life, and not just literally, but in every aspect. There's so many agreements that we have broken with ourselves, whether it's this year, this week, this month, this decade, whatever it is. And your brain doesn't forget them, and it doesn't remind you either after a certain point. But you have to figure out what you've said that you're going to do, and decide if that's something you want to do, if it's important, if it's urgent, if it's something that will make you happy and add value to your life. And if it's not, scratch it off the list. Literally write a list of everything you ever said you'd do, and either get it done or get rid of it, so that at a subconscious level your brain can start to compute and process the things that actually matter. And just in this past couple of weeks, I've started to finally get into that habit where I've been telling people that have a hard time waking up in the morning, put your cell phone on the other side of the room so that you have to get out of bed to turn off your alarm, have a glass of water, go to the washroom and stay awake, eat a breakfast, go for a walk, let the sun hit your face, and breathe in fresh air. You've been breathing shallowly for 8 hours or more, and you need to recirculate your oxygen. You need to stretch every day. You're constantly in a position where you're not stretching and you're not growing. And if you let that slide for 2-3 days, you're back to square one. And it's hard, like we keep saying, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it, and it doesn't mean it doesn't get easier every day. How great could you become if you started doing everything to better yourself?
Just a quick side note on that point. I talk to all my friends about yoga. I'm like, hey, why don't you try yoga? You're always complaining about not being flexible and your back hurts. He's like, no, I'm just not flexible enough to do yoga. That's like saying you're not good enough at guitar to practice.
Seriously. And
Like, that's why you do yoga, is to get more flexible and get better at it. You don't just do yoga and then all of a sudden you're a yogi that's more flexible than anybody you could encounter on the street. It's a learning curve. It's progress.
you got to take the first step, and then the second one, and the third one. And you have to really assess the story you're telling yourself. So many people are at effect. The world is too hard. My life is this. My parents are that. My girlfriend is this. My job is that. And it's like, yeah, but there's so many people that have the same problems and a different mindset. So why do you get to tell yourself that you're not good enough, that you're not worthy? You need to change the dialogue.
You need to treat yourself like somebody you're responsible for helping.
Perfect segue. What are you going to say, Pat?
Well, this is going off topic, but that kind of reminds me of what you said about looking at the things that you want to do and then scratching it off if it doesn't help you. It reminds me of another book which we should think about reading for Bookwave. It reminds me of what Marie Kondo says about organizing and making sure that your room and your house is all tidy and not a complete cluster. In her book, The Life-Changing Art of Tidying Up, or The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, she mentions that kind of method of taking a piece of clothing or a book or a memento and asking, why is this important? Is this relevant in my life now? And if not, throw it out. The same could be said what occupation you want to do or a hobby that you want to do. And you have to think very carefully about it too. And what impact it will have on you, especially when you want to be the best version of yourself.
Absolutely. One more note on that before we talk about the second chapter. Two of the things that I really liked that Marie Kondo talked about was waking up the objects, the physical, actual tapping of the books and the clothing, and saying hello to them and thanking them for being something that sparks joy in your life. And, it's like New Age feng shui, that everything that is around you, your subconscious is processing and making decisions and calculations about. And when you actually physically invoke a gratitude practice with those objects that are in your life, you're adding energy to them, and that energy is infused into you at all times. It's like your yoga mat. Every time you step on that mat, you infuse it with energy, and you need to make sure that that space that you practice in is sacred, and you don't welcome negative energy. You encourage the positive stuff. That's why aromatherapy is so helpful. That's why so many of these things that people take as woo-woo side crap that other people need because they don't know how to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they take it for granted, when really it's like, well, imagine how much more effective you could be if you were already able to kill it all the time, and then you added all of these other things that would just add value to your life and not take them for granted. So jumping into the second rule, as we mentioned, it's taking care of yourself as though you were someone who was in your, oh my goodness, what's the name of the chapter, guys?
Treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping.
I swear I read them. Yeah, and it's so true. And again, we get into the Bible references and the metaphors about Adam and Eve and original sin, and it puts original sin in another light for me since we visited Atlas Shrugged. And of course, I'm again recalculating and redeciding my opinions about everything. I'm still young, but it's interesting, like not being able to walk with God because you're ashamed of yourself, because you're self-conscious and aware of just how far from the mark you are. But you don't have to look at it that way. You can say that's how far I am from the mark, but I can see it and I can take the first step and I can improve myself.
I don't like thinking about it as like we're all born with this evil sin inside of us, but the way Jordan Peterson articulates it, with it just being that you have to improve yourself and work on your own demons, I like that a lot better.
Yeah, it's more matter of fact. It's not that we're this evil failure, spineless turd. It's that there's so much more we could do. And original sin isn't about shame. It's about growth and empowerment and becoming worthy of yourself and others around you, and growing and knowing that you'll never stop learning.
Yeah, and this chapter has one of my favorite lines, which is a quote from Solzhenitsyn, which is, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being."
Yeah, I liked that line as well. That was a really good one. And that ties into the Tao and the yin and the yang that Pat was bringing up. You know, that's the center between these two snakes that are constantly battling. And we have to accept that we have the worst and the greatest inside of us. And we can't pretend that we're anything less or more than what we are. And when we finally accept that, that's when we can start to embrace the shadow and the persona and walk in glory, right?
Mm-hmm.
He also defines life as drama and fiction, and those two intertwine with life. And then he adds a third element, which is consciousness. And what I got out of that is not doubting the validity of existence, but to understand that it's there and allowing our consciousness to make a path either inside or outside of these two planes.
Yeah, and so there's that quote, right? I think, therefore I am. And we've seen it revised a couple of times. We've seen I feel, therefore I am, and I act, therefore I am. And we have to include the three, you know, thoughts are important to a degree, then they become destructive. Feelings are important to a degree, then they become all consuming and
I like John
bastardize
Galt's
your
version.
thoughts.
I like John Galt's version. I am, therefore think.
Yes, exactly. And I think that John Galt would really resonate with that. I act, therefore I am, because action maketh man. People aren't going to remember you for how sorry you felt for yourself or how much you thought about what you might be capable of. You know, you have to go out there and face the world. You have to show up and you have to give it your all. Whatever your all is, you know, you're in competition with yourself. It's not survival of the fittest. It's that nature destroys the weakest. And it's so much easier to not be the weakest than it is to be the fittest. And when you stop worrying about these existential corporations and actually take responsibility for your life, you'd be surprised to see just how much of an impact you can have on big things like climate change and poverty and so many other things that are hot topics and trending words right now. But you need to start with you. You can only be the change in the world if you change yourself.
And of course, it doesn't happen overnight.
No.
It takes a lot of mastery to do. I'll admit, this is something that I've been struggling with, and I'm still working on it.
And kudos to you, you know, like that's step one, accepting who you are, right? You can't get past any stuck emotion without being honest with yourself.
Yeah, know thyself. Know thyself. That's the first step.
Yeah. I like, I forget where I read it, but most people, when they're starting a new hobby, quit in the first 20 hours. And to master something, it takes 10,000 hours. And 10,000 hours is really intimidating. That's 40-hour weeks for 5 years or so. And when you look at it that way, you can intimidate yourself. It's very easy to do that. But when you look at it like everybody that starts this hobby, the majority of them quit after 20 hours. So if I do 21 hours, I'm already ahead of the majority of people that have given up. So now all of a sudden you can look at it and you can say, if I get through this first 20 hours, then I've made some significant progress and I can find myself quite happy with where I'm at after 50 hours, 100 hours, and forget about the amount of commitment find what you love and pursue it, and put aside time consistently every day, every week.
Start small.
Exactly.
You can just do maybe 15 minutes of a hobby a day and then quit when you want to.
Yeah.
And then do it the next day. And then next week you can do 30 minutes.
There's so many people that jump into things and they think, okay, I need to give this my all. And they don't understand what that actually means, because there's giving it your all and there's giving it more than you have to give. How many people have, like, I know I have gone to the gym after 6 months off and tried to do the workout they were doing the last time they were consistent. And now they're out and they're sore and they've pulled their muscles and they're done for 3 days. It's like, that doesn't help you. That wasn't your all. That was more than you had to give. Start with a little bit. Start with what you can do. Stop before you're exhausted, fainting and puking, and then come back tomorrow and give it a bit more and build the muscle.
But like we noticed in Dante, the first step is always the hardest, and it gets easier from there.
Yeah.
I guess we could talk about one of the more controversial ideas, Jordan Peterson in Rule 2, about his comparison of chaos and order as masculinity and femininity.
Is it controversial? I guess some people could call it controversial.
Well, he mentions in his lectures that of the great father and the great mother, the mother being all caring and the father being tyrannical. And again, I know I've mentioned this a few times, but I can bring it up again as a great example. The movie The Tree of Life is a good example of the examination of nature and grace. Nature is like a father figure and grace is like a mother figure. And they both have their pros and cons of it.
I think it's interesting because, like, especially with neuroscience or whatever it is, again, not educated in the subject, but when you look at the hemispheres of the brain, the right side is responsible for creativity and the left hemisphere is responsible for logic and reasoning. And you need both. And it's not to say that a man is just a man or a woman is just a woman or a person is just one type of person, you know, that, like Jung says, we have both inside us, the anima and the animus. And when you neglect all that you are, you do a disservice to yourself. You need to know that it's okay to access both sides of your personality and really explore who you are. Because when you go at life with just 50% and you just lean on logic your whole life, you're missing out on so much there is to experience.
Same with creative types who relish in imagination but not look at what's going on in reality.
And I think that's why we get to that notion that opposites attract. You know, you need someone who's got their head in the clouds and someone who's firmly rooted on the ground. And you can learn so much from people that are so different from you. And to be able to have one foot in chaos and another in order, to be able to go forth with a balanced understanding of the world.
Almost like the perfect relationship is like the yin-yang symbol.
Absolutely it is.
Like the two fish, the one black and the one white, they each have a little bit of the other inside of them.
When you have too much good, you end up creating bad. And when there's all darkness, the light will come out from the center of it. And you can't neglect either half of the coin. It'll become a two-dimensional existence. And that's paper thin and easy to blow over.
Yeah, the reason I say it's controversial, or the reason I believe it's a controversial thing, is because people just mishear what he's actually saying.
Mm-hmm.
They just hear masculinity and femininity, and they think, oh, he's talking about men and women now, and the difference between men and women.
It's like, no, put your trigger radar down. Stop looking for something to jump on and bite the face off of the messenger. Like, that's not the point.
These people are all victims. And what Jordan Peterson says in the book is that victimhood isn't a virtue. It's a weakness.
Yeah.
And I also like how I know that we have a lot to go over in the next few weeks with this book, but I like how Jordan structures the 12 rules, starting with rule 1, which is like a biological look into the physique of animals and of humans and being born from it. And then he goes straight into, okay, you're here now. Here's the second rule. Now, see if you can treat the person next to you who is already born with some responsibility and proper treatment. And then he goes on from there. So that's an interesting structure that I've noticed. I don't know what you two think about that.
I hadn't considered it in that light, but I mean, it certainly speaks to his efficiency in delivering this, because this is something that he's been working on for quite some time. Like, it grew out of Maps of Meaning, from what I understand. And his ability to publish this book and the success he's had is no accident. He is a very intelligent man, and I think we're quite lucky to have this man sharing himself and putting himself on that stage. Lord knows the arrows are just firing away all of the time, and he's chosen to be, in as much a capacity as he can. And for that, I'm very grateful.
Yeah, the origins of this book is pretty fun thing to talk about too, because like most of the concepts and ideas, like you said, came from Maps and Meaning. But it started when he like posted like a post on Quora or something like that.
Yeah.
Into like the 42 rules of life. And then he just like posted that. Everyone started to like it. So we condensed it into a book.
Mm-hmm.
He's releasing the sequel to this book pretty soon, I believe.
Really?
I think he's going to yeah, something like that. Sometime next year.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say that was a really good chat. I'm a little out of content to discuss, quite frankly.
I have a couple more notes, actually.
Okay.
I like how he talks about the golden rule in this chapter and how it's an equation, not just a rule. Because playing the victim creates a tyrant, as well as playing a big shot creates resentfulness. And playing the boss is like creating slaves. It's not just enough to treat them how you want to be treated. You have to treat them how you believe they should be treated.
And treat yourself how you want to be treated.
Yeah, that's the other half of the title of this rule.
Yeah.
It's kind of like how George Orwell, when he wrote 1984, brought up the 3 stances. I forgot what they were called, but like, I don't know, what war is peace, slavery is freedom, and whatever else. I don't know if you do remember that, but
I'm searching, man. It's been a couple of years since I've read 1984, but I know what you mean.
His warning about that and just how far ahead of his time he was, it just reminded me of that.
What was the other note you had there, Scott?
Well, I was thinking you didn't really say much about it in this rule, but it made me think about just the concept of waking up or awakening, and how it should be viewed as the exact same thing as just growing up. Because sometimes you have people that just go through a tiny life change and all of a sudden they're woke and they're a different person. But then you have all these people that don't go through any change at all and they just join a club and then they get their woke card and they're allowed in the club of people that are actualized human beings.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the Jung book that I was reading, he talks about how through the school system, we train people to be able to have a job and get married. And then when you hit adulthood, there's no book that tells you all the things that you'll understand when you grow up, and learning stops for the majority of people. There's no more growth. That's it. And they go through failed marriages and change careers every 5 years. Maybe if they're lucky, they'll actually go back to school and reinvest in themselves. But so many people just keep beating that horse that's already dead, and they don't actually wake up and look at the patterns and say, you know what, this bad habit has persisted for more than 6 weeks. If it's persisted for more than 6 weeks, you need more resources. You don't have enough resources to make a change on your own. You need to ask for help. You need support. We're an interdependent species, not independent and not codependent. We're interdependent. Yeah. We have to grow from the people we surround ourselves with. And that leads into the next podcast and the next couple rules, certainly.
Yeah, Jung talks a lot about the child in a man's body.
And so does Buddha.
Yeah.
And also learning to let go of old culture and old traditions and old habits that have plagued you all your life, and just look for alternatives.
Vishen Lakhiani in the Code of the Extraordinary Mind coins the term rules, which are, pardon my French, bullshit rules. If this cultural norm or societal norm or this rule or agreement that you've made with yourself, maybe even at an unconscious level before the time you were 7, doesn't work for you, look at it and tell yourself, no, I refuse. That's not good enough for me. My standard is higher than this. We can do better as individuals, as people, as cultures, as societies, countries, world, what have you. You need to constantly assess what you're telling yourself, what's being told to you, and make sure your filter is on the right setting, externally and internally.
And don't get so bummed out about hierarchy. That's another good rule.
Yeah.
Or a good lesson from these rules, I should say.
Yeah, they've been around for 350 million years. It doesn't mean that they're trying to keep you down. It means that you have a way up.
And he goes over the Matthew principle and all that stuff.
Would you refresh our audience on that one?
That's like the ratio of like 8 to 2 that just exists in the world. In the Bible, it says something like those who have nothing, or from those who have nothing, more will be taken, and from those who have everything, more will be given.
Yeah, and it's so true. When you're down on yourself and feeling sorry for yourself, you're going to find at every turn you lose something more. And when you allow yourself to attract greatness and start to appreciate what you have, you'll find more. It's all in your mindset, and it sounds woo-woo, and it kind of is, and that's okay. But if you don't have a practice of actually being grateful, and you don't take stock of the things that make you good, great, happy, better, joyful, and all you look for is the negative, you're going to find more negative. The person that goes into a parking lot expecting not to find a parking spot isn't going to find a parking spot. Likewise, the person that goes in expecting to find the perfect parking spot will. Any closing remarks, boys?
Stand up straight with your shoulders back and treat someone that you were responsible for helping. That's all I got.
Well, may the force be with you, audience.
And also equal to mass times acceleration.
Hell yeah.
Poof, poof.